Ja, mange tak for indbydelsen. Det er en stor fornøjelse for mig at være i Bergen og tale til så mange folk, der er dybt engageret i specialsamlinger. Det er også en stor fornøjelse for mig, fordi jeg har faktisk aldrig været i Bergen før. Og det er jo noget af en skandale. Som I hører, taler jeg dansk. I kan godt forstå mit danske, jeg forstår jeres norske, men jeg har aldrig arbejdet på dansk. Så jeg finder det svært at tale om mit arbejde på dansk, og derfor taler jeg nu engelsk. I was asked to talk about what constitutes special collections, and it is a good question because it sounds very simple, but it isn't. You might argue, and I would sort of tend to argue, that there is no such thing as special collections. But that, of course, would be nonsense. I don't want to be Schopenhauer, and sometimes I deny the existence of the real world. You all have special collections. They exist physically. I don't want to be Humpty Dumpty either, and saying that words just mean what we claim they mean. Although Humpty Dumpty was wise, he does end up by saying that the meaning of words depend on power. And that, I think, is something that will underlie some of what I will be talking about today, and something which is worth bearing in mind when we deal with the collections which are entrusted to us. In its report on special collections, OCLC defines special collections as you see here on the screen. But I fear that they're merely confirming that special collections are what they call special collections. They dress it up as a definition. They present a list of things which they consider to be part of the category, but lists of examples do not make up a definition. And even if they're considered as a list, it is methodologically random. And it reminds me of the 16th century author, Cadamus, who said that the category of stones is made up of gemstones, marble, whetstone, flints, and rocks. You've got to be a bit more systematic, even if you come up with lists of examples. So I much prefer the definition of the University Library of Yale, which isn't a definition, but just say some of the characteristics which they think that special collections at Yale all have in common. Our institutions are responsible for collections and collections items which are important to people at home and abroad, whatever you might mean by those two words. Collections for which we are responsible carry meaning for other people. Otherwise, I suppose we wouldn't have them. But they do not convey meaning without the help of others. That is to say, from people who find them significant in one way or another. It's this potential for carrying meaning which makes it possible for us to work with others and work for others, so that they can find a use which is of importance to them in the collections which we are responsible for. Simultaneously, it is the same potential which gives us responsibility to enable people to engage with material which they regard as important for them. As professional librarians, we describe, structure, classify our collections. This is a plain practical necessity. Unless you do that which we call collections wouldn't be a collection, but merely an aggregation of random objects which nobody could make any sense of. To outsiders especially, this can give an impression of something stable, of something fixed, and to a critical outsider, it can give the impression of us representing institutions who seek to imply that there is one specific way of understanding our collections. There's one authorized way of doing it, as if we, in the word of Humpty Dumpty, claim to be masters. This criticism is most often expressed in the context of how museums approach their materials rather than libraries. But it is often assumed that we have the same issues in the context of libraries and archives. And I would argue that it's only partly the case. Museums and galleries typically engage with their audiences in a highly mediated way, offering interpretations as the main way for people to enter into contact with the collections. Libraries and archives do that as well, but for us, the most fundamental way in which people engage with our collections is different. We offer our collections up to people to use, handle, examine, and read themselves. We make it findable through metadata. I always point out to the board of the British Library that at any given moment, people in our reading rooms are themselves handling objects worth millions of pounds, things which in museums they would only be allowed to see through a glass pane. People engage differently with our collections. That doesn't mean that the way we describe things is neutral. Metadata isn't neutral, and it should, of course, be subjected to continuous critique. But it does mean that it is our readers, our users, who make sense typically of our collections. They are the main interpreters of our collections, not us. However, when we single something out as a special collection, we single something out for special treatment, we do approach the area where we assume a role of which is closer to a museum role of offering our own views, our own interpretation. So we do have a special responsibility for being transparent to people from the outside about how we select material for inclusion in our collections, how we select material for being treated as special. For me, the public accountability of why we devote resources specifically to one type of material rather than to another type of material is important, because that enables our work to become part of a public debate where people can understand our decisions, criticize our decisions, which is a fundamental part of being part of democratic society. Unless you make it clear what you do and why you do it, people are not in a position to say, I disagree, you should have been doing that. Rather, once you're open about what you do, you are an equal partner in a discussion. So transparency in what we do, I think, is important. So thinking about it is about special collections is important, even if we might in the end think that everything we have is special. And I, of course, believe that all my collections are special, both the web and the oracle bones. I suggest that there may be two main reasons, distinct but interrelated reasons, for regarding something as special. One is very directly linked to perceptions amongst people who use our collections. Another set of reasons evolves around the running of our institutions. They're linked, of course, to our users, to researchers and their needs, even if indirectly. I'll first look at some of the internal reasons for treating something as special, and then move from that to looking more closely at how we deal with changing needs of users. In the British Library, we don't, in fact, operate with the concept of special collections, but that doesn't mean that we treat all collections and collection items the same. Perhaps one way of looking at special collections is to think of them as those collections which fit badly into our classification of knowledge, and therefore badly into our standard descriptive and heuristic tools. So here's just one example. The British Library has some 200,000 playbills, theatre posters, from the 18th and 19th century. They fitted badly into the library's traditional standards. So the special way we used to treat them was to treat them specially badly. We gave them very broad archival type catalogue entries like 13 volumes of playbills from Liverpool. With changing research interests and with changing approaches to research, this was bad from many perspectives. They were difficult to find if you didn't know their existence already, and easy to steal because we didn't have a detailed record of what we have. So we chose to do what we find quite difficult. We digitized them without sufficient metadata. That is, single them out for special treatment, because we can afford to digitize only a fraction of our collections. You mentioned 170 million items. We believe that we've digitized about 2 or 3% of our collection. So even for a digitized output, we stayed with minimal metadata, just a line per volume, more or less. So one line of metadata for, well, 200 or 300 separate items. Now they can be consulted online, but they're still quite difficult to find. So we also then launched a very actively promoted crowdsourcing working activity, working with university teachers, teaching theatre history, English literature, queer studies, animals in the 19th century, whatever, creating much more detailed metadata now for each sheet through a very structured process which enabled us to enhance our metadata based on the research interests of our users. And indeed, the process of engaging with our content also became part of the educational process of people on undergraduate and on MA courses. So we began by treating them especially badly. Now we treat them differently, but still specially. Then there are physical needs. Oh yes, this is an example of one of these. You can see how difficult it is to give a standard catalog entry for something like that. And you can see that basically a collection of playbills from Liverpool is all the metadata which we had for it. Here an example of some of the crowdsourcing work which has been doing on it, where people extract basically titles and places, personal names, which then helps other people. And we have a method for integrating it into our metadata, own metadata repository. Another way of singling material out for special treatment is if it has special physical needs, physical vulnerability. It may be singled out for conservation treatment, access to it may be restricted, or take place under special conditions. Some things are only accessible under one-to-one supervision, so very special treatment. Our two priorities of the British Library in this respect is our collection of fragile newspapers, to which we have very exceptionally devoted some of our grant from government to digitization, and sound, where we have a special program called Save Our Sounds, aiming to migrate sound that's on the point of being lost, either because the support it's recorded on, so the physical thing it's recorded on is deteriorating, or because the playback equipment is breaking down and can't be replaced. We believe that within 15 years, 60% of our sound collection will be inaccessible unless we do something about it. So we've allocated significant money to this, so a very good reason why we treat this material as special material. Vulnerability to theft is another factor in differentiating how we treat material. One main way of doing that is through a set of reading categories for us, where we assign each collection item the level of protection it has when it's being consulted, how it's being stored, how it's being accessed. How do we select? Through market value. But market value is a variable and difficult thing to operate with. Ease of theft conjoined with marketability is perhaps a better way of doing it. Here you see how individual fashion plates from the 19th century, not individually very valuable, but if you have lots of them, you make quite a lot of money. And there are lots of them, and they're relatively easy to steal and to sell. So we offer special, or we try to offer special protection to material which we identify as especially vulnerable to theft. And here you see, just from a Google search, from one of our magazines, which is has been, unfortunately, you can't quite see what it says over on the left, but it sort of says how many of the plates are wanting for ours, and here you see them available for sale on the market, and visibly torn out from a volume. You might think that that's something that rogue people on eBay do, but if you look very closely, some of the people who do that are reputable and dealers of antiquarian books. We protect material, give special measures for material which is vulnerable to theft. Or it can be material which is surrounded by controversy, where there are strongly opposing views attached to its meaning and its present function, such as this piece of typewritten material from 1917. It's a typed letter, on perfectly standard, commercially available paper, but it is the Balfour Declaration, the declaration which by some is seen as the beginning of a national catastrophe in Palestine, and by others as the beginning of the State of Israel. The controversy means that it is afforded special protection, both when it is consulted, and we take special measures for how we display it, and indeed for how we engage with people who want to borrow it for display. So here we are evidently already moving in the direction of special collections, and the way we behave with it as determined by perspectives of our users. My final example of material which is treated as special for internal reasons are those items which are acquired in special ways. Our standard acquisitions take place through commercial agents which we have selected through a public tender process. That's a way of ensuring that we spend public money appropriately. But that is not suitable for a lot of material. So one could say that special material, special collection material, is a sort of material which you can't buy through normal procurement processes. So in order to satisfy the reasonable demand for transparency, we formalized our process for acquiring special material. And proposals for acquisitions are made to a group which assesses it against a number of criteria, which you can see have to be fairly broad in order to satisfy the variety of material which we have acquired in the last few years, relating some of the people whose work we have been seeking to document. So we ask if it fits our collection development policy, if it is of national, international importance, if it has research potential, if there are commercial opportunities, and if there are reputational issues with acquiring or not acquiring. Then we score it, and if somebody asks, our scorings are publicly accessible so people can see why is it we've decided to spend public money on this rather than that. So we also keep the documentation for the material we decide not to buy so people can see and therefore engage in a critical discussion with us of what we do. Maybe uncomfortable, but it's better than not being a part of a public discourse. Scoring like this also reveals when our acquisition policies may need revision. Recently, we decided to accept a donation of the archive, The Last Rabbi of Baghdad. It fitted our acquisitions policy really badly because our policy did not take into account archives brought to Britain by immigrant populations. But such archives are, of course, also important for people in Britain today. And by people in Britain today, I don't mean only the immigrant population, but for everybody in Britain today. So we used this as an opportunity to say, actually, thinking of this, we realized that we need to formulate some of our acquisition processes. It's the very formal process which we have, which enabled us to reconsider and revise our collection policy. And also why it in the end will be open to scrutiny and to challenge. So in that sense, our heritage acquisitions are special collections because they're acquired through a special process. Then we have a number of considerations which are special, which are legal and ethical. There's a growing body of formal national and international law and informal guidance around this. I don't expect you to read this. This is just to give you an impression of the range of legal instruments which we have to take into consideration when we acquire material. Not only do we seek to act legally, we may want to acquire items and they may be legal, but is it right to do so? It is in itself wrong, and the trade in stolen property can be part of international organized criminal activity ranging from terrorism to money laundering or both. So we have a formal process, again open to public scrutiny, that we acquire only things which we have very thoroughly investigated, so we do not believe that they've been illegally excavated, plundered, illegally exported, or stolen. It requires a lot of work and a lot of familiarity with export regulations, legal situation in many different countries. But it is, of course, also something which colleagues, curators very much value, because it is a formal way in which a big institution values their professional ability to engage with the detective work, which is otherwise broadly known as provenance research. Just an example of this, a curator wanted to borrow the Vinland map for an exhibition on 20th century mapping. That should really have been completely unproblematic, because we all know that it's a fake. It's a 20th century fake, so it fitted in very well into a 20th century exhibition. But the map is drawn on a piece of vellum. That piece of vellum is now in Yale, where when they bought it in the 1950s, made a great spiel of proving that that piece of parchment could be proved to be old, because it could be proved to be previously been part of the binding of two early 15th century manuscripts. So far all right. However, those two 15th century manuscripts could also, with a little bit of work, be shown to have been stolen from a cathedral in Spain. So the Vinland map is not only a fake, it's drawn on a piece of parchment which has been stolen from a cathedral in Spain. That means that I could not accept that we would borrow it for an exhibition, because we cannot borrow and publicly display material which I believe is part of a stolen collection. So the acquisition can lead to quite detailed provenance research, which colleagues enjoy doing. So I think that dialogue between giving value to people's professional expertise and showing how that is part of ethical behavior is really important. It's clear that many of these functional descriptions of materials which need various degrees of special attention have a close relationship to users' needs. So I'll now turn to the notion of special collections from the perspective of people who use our collection, groups of people, however they might define themselves as a group. If we look at special collections as collections which are singled out for special treatment because they're especially important to people, it takes our understanding of special collections in the direction of cultural heritage material. And I'll try to look at the special collection from the perspective of cultural heritage, kulturarv, as we say in Danish and Norwegian. The founding text on cultural property is the Hague Convention of 1954, which describes cultural property as property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. Now, this is a slightly odd phrase in English, of every people. That must mean that the lawyers who drew it up had something rather special in mind in order to choose a very slightly odd phrase. And that makes you think of the conditions under which the Hague Convention was drawn up, signed in 1954, 1 year after the ratification of the European Convention of Human Rights, and 6 years after the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights. In fact, the three conventions were drawn up by lawyers, often the same lawyers, from some of the victorious countries of the Second World War. The Hague Convention echoes very strongly the phraseology of the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights, which emphasizes our shared belonging to the human family. The great emphasis on our shared humanity in these conventions is a clear reflection of the experience of the civil servants, academics, soldiers, lawyers, who were so deeply influenced by the horrors of the Second World War. And I think that's important to remember in a political climate where the notion of human rights is under attack, again, even here in Europe. If I speak from the country I work in, it's worth remembering that Theresa May, our former Prime Minister, has been an active voice calling for Britain to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights. I think remembering where it comes from is important for us all. The Hague Convention of 54 provides a very succinct guidance towards the definition of cultural property. It defines it as movable or immovable property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. It sees the defining characteristics of cultural heritage as inherent in the way in which it is construed by people for whom it is important, not in the objects themselves. And that takes us back to the concept of it being of importance to every people. The Hague Convention very clearly understands cultural heritage as something which, yes, is created within one cultural context, but by that very fact that it's created by human beings in one context, is important to us all because we belong to the same human family. So in terms of special collections, something which is especially important in the group where it's been created or for people of special interest, but it is important for us to make sure that we understand it as being important not just for that group, but for everybody, for the whole of the human family. Let's see if I have got. Yeah, I like this from Meldal Kommune, which I don't quite know where they've got the wording from, but I think that it captures the breadth of cultural property of Kulturarv very well as being something which is ultimately determined by people themselves and not by a higher body, so to speak. Here I just some examples of the impact on the written cultural heritage, the radical disagreement about the importance of special collections. If special collections are special because of the importance attached to them, they can also be specially despised or specially hated. It need not be as drastic as this, but people do disagree about our past and our present, and the past was not more free from conflict than it is today. Therefore, for me, the approach to the Hague Convention has stood the test of time. It doesn't mean that it's always been implemented, but the ideas behind it have stood the test of time. The Hague Convention tends towards a philosophical view of humanity and our intellectual productions, which in the end derives from an Enlightenment view of humanity as universal, equal, united, and our ability to be rational and to change as we discover more things about the world. The romantic challenge to the Enlightenment was given its first clear formulation, as I'm sure most of you know, in Herder's Philosophy of History, auch eine Philosophie der Geschichte from 1774, based on a view of culture that distinguishes one people from another, seeing there's something innate in a people, which meant that its cultural manifestations were essentially different from the cultural manifestations of others. In opposition to the subjugation of the German states by the troops of Napoleon and disillusioned by the way in which Napoleon armies expressed universality as equivalent to French domination, Herder's view was radicalized, as again I'm sure many of you know, by Fichte, especially in his Reden an die deutsche Nation from 1808, where it was radicalized into a belief in an inherently and essential difference expressing the true nature of a people. Culture became a defining part of the emergent nation, which could and did lead to a view that there can be no real understanding between cultures, to a view of immutability, cultural purity, unaffected by corrupting contacts with others. Fichte also clearly expressed the nearly inevitable consequences of this, that some people are superior to others. Furthermore, at its logical conclusion, this view of culture restrains the individual's freedom to make choices for our own life, the individual freedom being subsumed to the duty to one's social group or to the state. This concept of culture, Kultur, was deeply formative, not just for Germany and the creation of the German national identity, but for the creation of nation states in Europe in the 19th and 20th century. That became slightly a bit of a parody. Towards the First World War, on both sides of the conflict, there were two ways of looking at the creativity of humanity. Crystallized into an opposition between French civilisation and German Kultur. And these two concepts, I think, are still being played out in our understanding of culture and cultural property, both that which identifies a group and that which can help us to transcend our group and understand the creativity, the engagement of others as part of that which we share. The words of the Hague Convention ring in my ears when we talk about material of every people. And I'm sure that the distinction between culture and civilisation was very present in the mind of the people who drew up the Hague Convention. It was a very, very prominent part of the debates during the First World War. So I'm sure the lawyers who drew up the Hague Convention was aware of this discussion when they defined what they meant by material of cultural importance. So when we recatalogue our collection of Ethiopian manuscripts, make them available online, blog about them, have an exhibition on them, we of course work with people of an Ethiopian background in London who have a special interest in this topic. Some of them do, at least some of them really don't care either way, but some of them do. But we also very much ensure that they reach a wide audience. We of course work with the Ethiopian government, with the Ethiopian embassy, with the Ethiopian Ministry of Culture, but also recognizing that the literary and artistic culture of Ethiopia is of importance to people wherever we are as an expression of our shared human engagement with the world. We seek to make it possible for as many to engage and relate to this special material, explaining its the circumstance of its creation, the culture it comes from, of course also how it came to the British Library, all as part of being enabling a broad group of people to engage with material for which we are responsible, while recognizing that it is rooted in one way in one group of people. The second fundamental international convention in this area is the UNESCO Convention from 1970. Now, it's easy to blame the UNESCO Convention in many ways, and I'm going to criticize it, but one must also remember there's a limit to what an organization of member states can do. The UNESCO Convention placed cultural property under the protection of state signatories to the convention, and it explicitly sees cultural property from the perspective of states. Let's see what happens now. Yes, saying that the term cultural property means property which on religious or secular ground is specifically designated by each state as being of importance. So for UNESCO, an object is of cultural property if a state goes through the bureaucratic process of including in a list of items whereby they are officially designated as culturally important. Meldal Kommune got it better, I think. Secondly, it has to be of importance for some specific disciplines, archaeology, prehistory, literature, art, science. And thirdly, it has to belong to a prescriptive list of types of objects, which also have to have a certain age. The examples, there are examples in the Hague Convention of cultural property, but it has here become a prescriptive list. The list is quite detailed, which is perhaps meant to make it inclusive, but actually means it is exclusive, because if you have a detailed prescriptive list, well, then everything that falls outside cannot be included. This is all very different from the Hague Convention. Despite its opening reference to the cultural life of all people and the civilization of man, the UNESCO Convention is very easy to interpret as giving weight to an understanding of culture as that which distinguishes, separates one group of people from another. It may also be interpreted as giving less importance to a cultural creation of a group of individuals who are less favored within current configurations, with the state or the government of the territory where they live or have lived. Which state now protects the Ottoman heritage outside Turkey? Which state protects the cultural heritage of Kurds? Which state protects the cultural heritage of the Uyghur today? The association of cultural property with national identity is deeply embedded in the thinking of UNESCO, understandably, as it's funded by member state. For example, UNESCO has created a list called the Representative List of Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity. The last two words make a nod to the Enlightenment view of civilization, but its implementation is firmly rooted in the view of culture that belongs that it belongs to states. Turkey has been very active in getting cultural phenomena onto the list of intangible cultural heritage, but unfortunately several times upsetting others in the process. They ensured that Karagöz was listed, and it was described as a form of shadow theatre in Turkey. The Greeks voted against, for they felt that Karagiosis was a Greek phenomenon, and the Greek authorities, in fact, formally protested to UNESCO. Undaunted, the Turkish government succeeded in getting Turkish coffee listed as part of Turkish cultural heritage. The Greeks tend to think of it as Greek. I took two pictures of Greek and Turkish coffee from a Google search. One is Greek, the other is Turkish, and I don't remember which is which. They then proceeded to do the same with an Anatolian stew, especially Turkish, although the Armenians think of it as specifically Armenian. UNESCO has since sought to modify the way they talk about intangible cultural property, but the underlying principles hasn't changed. They then tried to modify it, accepting that Karagöz exists in many countries, But they're unable to describe it as one cultural phenomenon which exists in many different cultural contexts. It's described as 3 different separate unlinked phenomena in 3 neighboring countries, which is sort of absurd, but that is typical of how the UNESCO conversion tends towards an understanding of cultural property as something which is associated with states. It also therefore tends towards an understanding of cultural property as stable and unfixed and unchanging. The American lawyer, yeah, it is very similar. I believe there's something very, very similar. Some of the Turkic-speaking people all the way over towards China as well. So clearly something has been happening in large parts of the world. Not that one. Okay. An American lawyer and academic, Naomi Macy, has argued that the association of culture with property in the concept of cultural property supports a naive, static view of culture, rather than one which emphasizes culture as a process of change and interchange, culture as authentic, pure, timeless, unsullied by external influences. She relates this view of culture to the way we perceive cultures of indigenous people as static unless contaminated through contact with modern globalized cultures. I agree with her critique, but I disagree with her that it's a view of culture which is exclusively applied to indigenous cultures. We see how closely related it is to the national romantic view of culture and the people. Nor do I agree that it's a naive view of culture. It's a view which is deeply rooted in a particular understanding of culture itself. If we think of it as naive, we fail to understand that it's a view of culture which is a deeply political act, which we therefore cannot act against. I therefore feel that we should take that valid criticism of an imperialist view of indigenous culture also more broadly as a valid approach to criticizing our own identification of cultures with states, with individual groups. In a less radical way, a criticism of a static view of culture is also found amongst anthropologists and archaeologists, some of whom have used it to challenge the stability of the Western cultural canon without also taking into account the instability of non-Western cultures, perhaps unintentionally consigning non-Western peoples, and indeed all those people who are not us, but those whom we study, to live in an anthropologically interesting ghetto from which they only escape by betraying their own cultures. In the academic context of law, within anthropology, archaeology, disciplines where these discussions are often based, the view of instability is perhaps more controversial than it is within our cultural institutions. For us, it conforms with our knowledge, long-standing research into our institutions, to the history of collecting, to history of collections. It's well documented how collecting interests and associations with market prices change very radically and very fast. Values are not permanent. Items can have a long-standing cultural importance, and they can acquire new but still profound meaning for groups of people, and their importance can equally be diminished over time or indeed completely vanish. We, as library professionals, should enable perceptions of culture, no less than memory, to be the object of analysis, not least if they're joined up with notions of property and property rights, or if they're associated with state sanctions or promoted identitarian politics. Special collections have a special role here. Adding a diachronic perspective is important for libraries and archives, where we steward objects which have radically changed their value over time. Just to give you an uncontroversial example, we know that in the 17th century, editions of Caxton, the first English printer, were no more expensive than any other second-hand book. As late as the 1790s, you could buy a copy of Caxton's Golden Legend for less than you would pay for a contemporary publications of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. during the next century, actually during the next 10 years, Caxton was to become a central part of English national self-identification. Slightly awkward that the first time he engaged with printing was in Cologne, and when he actually printed a book in English, it was in the part of the world which we now call Belgium. But hey, no one is perfect. He became an English national hero. So you could buy a copy of the Golden Legend for less. Now it is 18,896% more expensive than buying the Gibbon collection. So cultural values have changed very, very fast. Many of today's treasured objects were at some point in their existence useless. This is a single sheet of the Gutenberg Bible, often displayed in our treasures gallery, evidently a treasure. But it was acquired by John Beckford around 1700 amongst bits and pieces of old books, often from fishmongers, who used them for wrapping up scraps. So it has changed its ontological status many times: a religious text, a boring book, a piece of scrap, an interesting piece of scrap, national treasure. So changes in financial value and cultural importance are not uniform in time and space. These are all uncontroversial. This may be a little more controversial. Here you see one of the British Library's oldest objects, a Chinese oracle bone. Some of the very earliest Chinese scripts, of course of great importance for people in China, but indeed for us all. This, on the other hand, is a photograph which I took 2 years ago in an excellent permanent exhibition on oracle bones in the National Library of China, with whom we work closely on the interpretation of oracle bones. You see an apothecary ready to grind up oracle bones into powder based for medicine based on dragon bones. The assessment of the object sold to collectors by the apothecary is very, very different from the collector and from researchers today. That doesn't diminish their importance today, but it does mean that we need to understand that objects change the meaning, and we need to be able to understand this change as part of how we as human beings have changed our perception of ourselves in relationship to others. This sort of transparency around our collections and their changing meaning is part of providing tools for an informed examination of the past and the present. You can challenge that a person may have a certain perception of the past, but not the importance it has for them. But you can enable other people to say, you have this basis for understanding the past, but looking at a shared, publicly accessible set of data, we believe that you are wrong. And that's a fundamental part of the democratic process, understanding the past and how it helps with shaping the present, which we should enable people to engage in on the basis of a shared, equally accessible, trustworthy set of information, which can also itself be criticized through a transparent selection of material for special collections. I believe that this sort of shared and equal access is part of creating a justified basis also for the perception of us being citizens in a shared society, and therefore internationally for us as being part of the same human family, to use the word of Declaration of Human Rights. So when we devote special resources to creating special access and special interpretations, we take on a responsibility. We take on the responsibility of ensuring that people have informed access to the material which is important to them, but our role is not one of cozy confirmation of pre-existing perceptions. Special collections should also enable people to see that it's important for them within the wider context of a wider world within which they operate. We can't impose interpretations, but we should enable interpretations, and we should enable people to be open for their interpretations to be open to critique, to an informed debate, to see the specificity of our and their human engagement with things which are special to them, as part of a wider human engagement, ultimately as something which enables us to understand one another as belonging together, rather as something which separates us out as being different from the rest. Thank you.